Continuing a cold reading of Major Robert Crisp's classic of World War II tank warfare in North Africa, Brazen Chariots, the Ballantine 1961 paperback edition, page 26, second day. Before dawn the next morning, we were up and in our action stations, checking the wireless net and listening to the cautious chatter of B Squadron, who were being sent off on a special mission in support of the KDGs. As the light grew, we moved off several miles due north, where we sat and watched nothing for another 2 hours, with leisure enough to cook breakfast, bacon, biscuit, marmalade, and hot tea. Then came the message that we had all been waiting to hear, flickering through the hundreds of earphones on the battalion net. "Hello, Domo, Domo, calling. Domo will advance to Bir Gibni to intercept enemy column moving south." A little surprised at the direction of the move, which was due east of us, we swung round on the new bearing and moved briskly forward, not as carelessly as the previous day, but eager to start something. One could sense the mounting excitement that spread through each tank and from tank to tank through the whole battalion. In half an hour we reached Bir Gibni, eyes straining from the tops of turrets to the northern and eastern horizons for a glimpse of the significant silhouettes that would mean so much to each of us one way or another. But the desert stayed flat and was beginning to look vacuous. Later we were to get used to the daily swans into nothingness after nothingness, pursuing mirages of enemy conjured up by imagination and fear, mixed-up communications, mistranslated codes, and nerve-racked commanders. Later in the day, we heard B Squadron reporting that they were trying to engage 7 tanks and 3 armored cars. We all envied them. In another 10 minutes, there came the startling order to the remaining 2 squadrons to advance and engage 200 MET on the Tri-Capuzzo. I never did find out what MET stood for. Mechanized enemy troops, perhaps? But we all knew what it implied. 200 MET meant a long column of German vehicles ready to fall into our armored lap. Later, we were to discover that it also meant tanks and anti-tank guns and the dreaded 88s, the fantastic anti-aircraft guns that the Afrika Korps converted into the war's deadliest anti-tank weapon. Many men were to die on each side of me in finding out exactly what MET meant. The Tri-Capuzzo lay well north of the barren well of Gibni. It was an incredible highway stretching from horizon to horizon in an almost dead straight line, and pounded down to a width of 50 or 60 yards by succeeding convoys, all seeking the firm surface alongside the mutilated sand of the preceding column. There was another brief order telling C Squadron to attack the head of the column. I brought my troop over a long, low rise which ran down to the Trig about a mile in front of me. There I paused to let as many tanks as possible of the squadron come abreast of me in a hull-down position while I swept the column with my binoculars. It looked like a piece of cake, with only a few armored cars moving up and down the length of vehicles like shepherd dogs running beside a flock. I saw my other 3 tanks ready and waiting, and there was Harry alongside me, grinning. I gave him the thumbs up, and with a wide wave of my arm, we were off. We came over that crest, 16 abreast, and roared down the slope flat out, the wind catching the trailers of dust behind and flaunting them like banners of doom to the eyes of the watchers on the Tri. We were all caught up in the exhilaration of that first charge. In a few seconds, I could see the consternation in the enemy ranks translating itself into violent motion. There was the initial moment of immobility and shock, and then the whole line of vehicles broke and scattered wildly to the north and northeast. Every now and again, a vehicle would pull up while its occupants disgorged onto the sand and ran or fell flat. The main body of the enemy was making good its getaway, and indeed had virtually disappeared over one of the numerous escarpments by which the plateau dropped down to the sea. McGrath and I were compelled to divert our attention from the fleeing transport to several armored cars which were beginning to act in a hostile fashion. A couple of small Mark IIs were also bustling about like terriers with their teeth showing. We got 2 armored cars and one of the light tanks, and a little later I came across a third one, hurriedly abandoned by the look of it, with petrol still pouring out underneath the engine into a pool on the sand. My gunner put a burst of tracer into the pool, and the whole thing roared up in orange flame and black smoke. By this time we had left the Tri-Capuzzo miles behind. Some way to my front the land seemed to dip away into space. I guided the driver to the edge of a steepish escarpment and gasped with astonishment at what I saw. Beyond the intervening belt of rock and sand and scrub rolled the sudden deep blue of the Mediterranean. "Hell's bells, Harry!" I yelled into the mic. "I can see the sea!" Over to my right I got another shock. On the end of a promontory stretching out from the escarpment was a squat white building with what I thought was a minaret at one end. Through the binoculars it was revealed as a lighthouse, and beyond that I could see the roofs and walls of a sizable village climbing out of a deep wadi below the lighthouse. "Where the devil am I?" I muttered. Then it came to me. I was looking down on Bardia. I could hardly believe it, but it could be no other place. I scanned the intervening crests and depressions for some sign of the enemy and that column that we had been chasing. Then Harry's voice came urgently. "Look out, Bob! There are some anti-tank guns on your left." Even as he spoke, I heard a sharp bang and felt a slight shudder pass through the tank. I looked quickly down the turret. There was nothing wrong in there, and I gave the order, "Driver, reverse, advance, left about, speed up." 600 or 700 yards away, along the edge of the escarpment, little men moved agitatedly about a toy cannon. There was a puff of whitish smoke, and immediately I was conscious of something passing by in the air. It was time to get away. The other tanks were clustered behind a couple of camel-thorn bushes, and I thought how funny it was to duck instinctively behind something which could not possibly give any protection. I joined them behind the bushes and shouted at them that we'd better be getting back. For the first time that afternoon I was able to take stock of time and place, and I was a little worried to see how low the meager sun had sunk, turning the overcast a stormy red. A few lonely derelict lorries and armored cars littered the plateau, and several billowing uprights of smoke signaled the news of our first kills. I counted all 7 tanks of our 2 troops, but of the rest of the squadron and the battalion there was no sign. Through the mic I spoke to McGrath, running alongside. "Where the devil is everybody, Harry? Has the CO been on the air?" "I haven't seen anybody else since we crossed the Tri. We've been trying to raise the CO for the last 20 minutes, but can't get an acknowledgement." I was not particularly concerned at that stage. There was no sign of any enemy on all that wide plain or along the clean-cut ridges. All I had to do was keep the sunset on my right shoulder, and I was pretty sure of getting back to friendly territory. The one thing that disturbed me was the petrol situation. We had come a long way since morning, and I did not fancy being stranded so far from base. As the light failed, I picked out a small group of armored cars to the south, and we altered course slightly to approach them. I reckoned if they were enemy, we could cope with them, while if they were friendly, they would soon recognize the honeys, which were like nothing else in the desert. As we drew nearer, I noticed a couple of men walk casually away from the cars toward us, and realized with considerable relief that the troop must belong to our own Requescreen. I pulled up alongside and jumped down. "Hello," a young KDG subaltern said. "You had us worried for a bit, but there's no mistaking that shape. Where the dickens have you been?" I told him briefly of our adventures and then asked him for directions back to 3RTR. All he could tell me was a rough map reference for Brigade HQ, and I decided to head that way and try to get in touch by wireless as we got nearer. Our course was southwest now, with barely 10 minutes of light left in the sky and visibility at ground level reduced to a meager 100 yards. Then I felt the tank moving jerkily and got a tug on my trousers. "Whaley says we're out of petrol," my gunner shouted up at me. I swore quickly and then got on the air to the other tanks and told them to halt. The tank commanders came over. We had a quick conference and decided that as all tanks would shortly be out of petrol, we would logger where we were and try to get into communication with HQ. The blackness of night was upon us now, and we felt fairly secure in its impenetrability. I formed the tanks into a solid ring with guns facing outwards. My operator started yelling, and while I was still telling him not to make such a bloody row, he shouted that he had got the CO on the air. I jumped on the turret and swiftly explained the position. The CO said briefly that he had been trying to get us back all the afternoon and asked for our position. I made a very wild estimate, and he said he would send a petrol lorry out to me. There would be an officer with a wireless set, and we would have to guide him as much as possible. I handed the mic back to the operator and told him not to let go of that petrol lorry, or else we'd all be in the bag, or worse, in the morning. Then I prayed that I had not been too far out in my map reference, which placed us about 5 miles from the battalion lager. Half an hour later, the replenishment officer came on the air to tell us he was on his way, and would we let him have some toffee apples. This was the irrelevant name used for tracer bullets fired skyward in the night to indicate position. As long as it did not coincide with an air raid, it was an adequate signal and had the great merit of brevity, lasting just long enough for the expectant watcher to take a bearing. I got McGrath to stand by with a Tommy gun and then said into the mic, "Toffee apples coming up now." Harry pulled the trigger for about 2 seconds, filling the silence with an alarmingly staccato racket, while the red dots streamed upward into the darkness. I had the phones glued to my ears, and for a few moments there was an awful silence. Then the blessed words, "Have seen your toffee apples, coming in soon, watch out for me." It was well after midnight when we slunk into the battalion lager. The CO was still a bit peeved about our disappearance, but was mollified when I told him of our quite successful little raid. To our astonishment, the other half of C Squadron was still missing, and did not, in fact, get back until after sunrise. The colonel put us in the picture. There had been a heavy attack on 8th Hussars in the afternoon, and it was to go to their assistance that all our tanks had been so urgently needed. Other officers told me how they had seen the Hussars charging into the jerry tanks, sitting on top of their turrets more or less with their whips out. "It looked like those run up to the first fence at a point-to-point," the adjutant described it. This first action was very typical of a number of those early encounters involving cavalry regiments. They had incredible enthusiasm and dash and sheer exciting courage, which was only curbed by the rapidly decreasing stock of dashing officers and tanks. Very early on in that campaign, I learned when to be gallant and when to be discreet, and how to employ both characteristics to the best advantage of myself. Nearly every risk had to be calculated. Bravery, as far as I was concerned, became a matter of judicious discrimination and making the most of an opportunity. It is, after all, of very little use to yourself or your army to be very brave and very dead. That night, back in lager and shared security, I was full of confidence. We had put the enemy to flight, done him some damage, and were unharmed ourselves. McGrath and I returned to our troops from the CO, feeling rather pleased with ourselves and looking forward to daylight and its possibilities. When I got back, the LAD gang were at work under the honey with all the paraphernalia of repair littering the sand in the concealed island of light. "What's wrong, Lieutenant?" I asked. "You mean you don't know, sir? Cool, you've had a whole bogey wheel shot off. Any other sort of tank, you wouldn't have gone 10 yards. I remembered the crack and shudder on the escarpment, saw again the puff of smoke, and felt that invisible thing rushing past me through the air. I gave the side of the honey a little pat and settled down into the blankets to get as much sleep as the clanging mechanics would allow me. They worked hard right through the night, but the job could not be done in time, and before first light we had to change equipment, food, bedding, and crew with another tank. It was something I was to get pretty used to. That evening, a war correspondent called Randolph Churchill, gleaning colorful items for his readers, sent a message back to Cairo that, quote, Bob Crisp, the South African fast bowler, had got the first hat trick of the Crusader campaign by knocking out 3 enemy tanks with 3 shots, unquote. It was duly pinned up on the notice board at the Gezira Club. It was only a slight exaggeration. In another part of the desert that night, men of the German Reconnaissance Unit 3 were recording in their diary an attack by the enemy. He had very fast tanks, and the unit had to get away at full speed under continuous fire. The enemy forced the unit farther north over the Tricapuzzo and the first escarpment, and then withdrew southeast. Nobody else believed my story that I had looked down into Bardia that afternoon. To be continued.